Greetings, this is Greg. Let's look at how the Germans boosted the maximum speed of the final variants of the BF109 up to, and in some cases even beyond that of the P51D Mustang. I'm going to use pictures of this plane to represent all the late model 109s. Now, I know this isn't a real 109 G14 or 109 K4. It's not even a real 109. But as pictures of late model 109s are rare, I think you can cut me some slack on this one. This video will go into some mildly complex technical factors, so if you haven't already done so, I strongly suggest you first watch both my P51 Mustang manifold pressure video and my video comparing the early BF109G models against the P51 in terms of speed. I'll link both of those videos in the description below. If you watched my earlier videos, you know that the 109G series has an engine that's much larger than the P51's. It has 35.7 liters of displacement versus only 27 liters for the Mustang. Yet the P51's Merlin engine is more powerful, largely due to its ability to run at higher manifold pressure values, which are largely because of the higher octane fuel that was in use by P51's at the time. These factors, combined with some aerodynamic advantages, allow the P51 to fly much faster than the early 109Gs. Usually between 40 and 60 miles per hour faster, depending on the specific variants, altitudes, and some other variables. To address this, the Germans had to increase the power from the 109's DB605 engine. However, fuel quality issues, meaning lack of high-octane fuel, prevented them from simply increasing the manifold pressure, so they had to think a little outside the box. This led to the MW50 methanol water injection system, and the development of their higher octane C3 fuel. This video will focus heavily on methanol water injection. It's also possible to inject pure water or various ratios of water and methanol, so I'll cover that as well. We will be covering the later G models, including the G14, G10, and the K4. For this topic, we need to back up a bit. You see, the Germans didn't invent methanol water injection. The initial pioneering work in this field was done by an Englishman named Sir Harry Ricardo. During the interwar years, he wrote a 2-volume book called The High-Speed Internal Combustion Engine, which is excellent. This book established him as a leading worldwide authority on the subject of high-performance piston engines, and the Germans took notice of this. In fact, I believe in Ricardo's autobiography, written sometime later, he mentions that he actually received an award from Hermann Goering for engineering. Obviously, that was before Britain and Germany were at war. I'll put a link to the source for that in the description below. In any case, while the British didn't seem to pay much attention to methanol water injection, the Germans certainly did. Now, in order to understand how effective it could be, we'll have to turn to NACA. They have reports on everything, and on this topic, they went a bit crazy and did a huge amount of research. Unfortunately for the Americans, it seems that NACA and the U.S. Army Air Force initially went off in what, in my opinion, was entirely the wrong direction with this technology. They seemed to think that it would be best used to increase the range and payload of bombers rather than to increase power. The idea was this. They thought that if you could lean the air-fuel ratio out so much that you could save 10 pounds of fuel by injecting some lesser weight of water, then you could use that weight savings to carry more bombs and or increase range. And this benefit could be further increased by use of an exhaust water recovery system, which they did build. However, that idea never worked out in a practical sense, and the Americans came around to the idea of using this technology for an increase in power, so let's take a look at some of their findings. In September of 1944, NACA released a report showing that they were able to more than double the amount of power from a 1710 cubic inch V12 with the addition of water injection and a rich fuel mixture. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is just water injection and not water methanol, which we'll get into later. Water injection works by preventing knock, thus allowing a higher manifold pressure for a given fuel's octane rating. The NACA charts are a bit hard to read, so I summarized this report into one chart for you. Obviously, the full report is a lot more detailed, so you can go read it if you want to, but this covers the key information. The green bar on the far left shows our V12 running with a 12.5 to 1 air-fuel ratio, which was a pretty typical high-powered ratio. and putting out 750 horsepower with 36.5 inches of manifold pressure. I've been asked to include metric measurements, so I'll do that. 36.5 is 1.24 bar. With the fuel used in this test, that was the manifold pressure limit before knock occurred. Next, they richened the air-fuel ratio to 10.5 to 1. This allowed more boost and more power. It's now able to run 46 inches or 1.56 bar and 990 horsepower. This shows just how effective richening the mixture is at avoiding knock, but still it's nowhere near as effective as water injection. Next, they injected water. Now, they varied the amount of water injected in these tests, but I'm just showing the amount that provided the most power, and that was when the water was injected at a 0.6 to 1 water to fuel ratio. They called this CFR, for coolant fuel ratio, because they often referred to the water as an internal coolant. An amount greater than 0.6 to 1 at a 10.5 to 1 air fuel ratio would start to quench the combustion and cause a misfire. Thus, for this condition, 0.6 to 1 is as much water as you could spray. Now, third from the left, we can see that at 12.5 to 1 air fuel ratio and a 0.6 to 1 CFR, knock limited power went up to 1560 at 65.8 inches manifold pressure, 2.23 bar. At the far right, we can see that they combined the rich mixture with the water injection and got power up even farther with 71.4 inches of manifold pressure, or 2.42 bar. So by this point, it should be extremely clear just how much power water injection can add. However, there are some things to consider. First of all, to get that power, you have to add a lot of boost. Just spraying water in by itself doesn't add anything. There's another NACA report that shows that definitively. You do have to add boost to get the benefits, or in some cases, ignition timing. Furthermore, this test was done in a lab with very controlled conditions you would find difficult or impossible to duplicate in an airplane or a car. Plus, aircraft engines have dual spark plugs per cylinder, very powerful magnetos. Misfire is less of a concern in airplanes. But you can reasonably expect to get 20 to 30, even 40% more power with water or methanol water injection. Now, in the case of the NACA test, they were able to distribute the water very evenly between the 12 cylinders by using a spray bar system. So it had individual nozzles effectively for each cylinder. Now that matters because if you're spraying at the limit of what your engine can handle, if the fluid isn't distributed evenly, too much will go into one cylinder, causing a misfire, and possibly too little into another, causing piston damage or head gasket damage or something like that. Now, in most applications, less water is sprayed, and it's still very effective. With the richer air-fuel ratio and a 0.2 to 1 CFR, so 1/3 of the amount that they were using before, power was still 1355, and with a 0.4 to 1 CFR, it was 1530. So smaller quantities of water are still highly effective. Now we need to talk about methanol for a minute. NACA tried just about every chemical and combination you could think of. One of the reports on this is NACA 812. Again, I'm going to summarize it for you very briefly. There were two mixtures that were slightly better than water methanol. They were, and I'm probably going to mispronounce these, who knows, monomethylamine and water, and the other was dimethylamine and water. But apparently both of these two are controlled substances and they can be used to make some sort of illicit drug. And since they were only marginally better than methanol, methanol water was the only thing that was ever used operationally. Well, in some cases they use straight water or ethyl alcohol. We'll touch on that a little bit later. This particular report is often hugely misquoted and misunderstood, especially in the automotive world, but the gist of it is that a mixture of water and methanol is your best choice. This is supported by other NACA reports as well, although there are some weird cases involving air-cooled engines where water and ethyl alcohol is a better choice. A mixture of methanol and water allows about 20% more manifold pressure than pure water, and that's what almost everybody went with. So that should be the main takeaway from Report 812, that methanol water is the mixture you want. Now back to the BF109G series. The Germans knew that the only way to make it competitive with the P51 and other Allied planes that were coming out at the time was to increase the manifold pressure and to increase it a lot. The Germans measured manifold pressure in ATA, sometimes called ATA. That's essentially the same as bar, although, full disclosure, 1 bar is normally 1013 millibars, and it's possible that the Germans were using 1000 millibars for ATA. I can't confirm that for now, so I'm going to assume it's 1013, which is kind of the world standard, but the difference is so minor that it doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. Now, these changes to the late model 109s are seen in the 109 G14 and also in the G10, which was a late model G series, also available as an upgrade kit for older G variants to the new hotter specs. It should be noted that regarding the later 109s, there are many variables within each model. For example, in the case of the 109K4, there are at least 3 different versions of the DB605 engine that were used, 2 different types of fuel, 4 different mixtures for the MW50 system, and airframe differences. All of these factors rarely, if ever, are mentioned along with the performance specifications, which makes coming up with absolutely solid performance numbers a bit difficult, but I'll do my best to keep everything straight for us here. Now let's start with the later G models. In order to increase manifold pressure in these later models, the Germans created the MW50 system, which is a methanol water injection system. It's actually very simplistic. With the MW50 system spraying, the G14 can run at 1.7 ATA or 51 inches of manifold pressure. It has 1775 horsepower, and that's a lot more than the 1475 of the older G6 model. This gives the G14 a top speed of 413 miles per hour, and there's a high altitude variant called the G14 AS, which has its supercharger system optimized for fighting up high, and it has a top speed of 422 miles per hour. That's still not as fast as a P51D, but at least now the 109 was close. The speeds were close enough so that at least the P51s could not easily escape the fight any time they wanted to at will, as they could when fighting the G6s. Now let's talk about the MW50 system. MW stands for Methanol Water, or whatever those words are in German. Normally, it's set up to inject a mixture of 50% methanol, 49.5% water, with the remainder an anti-corrosive agent that is reportedly just the same oil that was used for engine lubrication. Sadly, as with many other aspects of German planes, there isn't much information out there on the MW50 system. In fact, I couldn't find a single picture of even a single system component. I've pieced this information together from various sources, but there weren't that many, so if you find an error or have something to add, please post it in the comments below. It seems that the system was ridiculously simple. They put a 22.5 gallon or 85 liter tank with the fluid behind the cockpit. They ran a fluid line to a nozzle or nozzles located at the supercharger's inlet. Then, when the system was engaged, in some variants, air pressure from the supercharger system itself, or in other cases, there was an auxiliary pressurized air tank, and that would pressurize the fluid reservoir. The pressure would force fluid through the line and into the nozzle, where it would be sprayed into the supercharger's inlet. Of course, there would be a problem with fluid distribution here. Trying to distribute fluid to 12 cylinders that way is not going to work out perfectly. It's never going to be just right when you inject fluid like that at a single location. However, it doesn't look like they were spraying enough for that to matter. In the case of the G14, they increased manifold pressure from 1.42 bar, 42.5 psi, up to 1.7 bar, 51 psi. Power went from around 1455. Now, sources vary on that number, about 20 horsepower either way. But power went up when the methanol water was turned on to about 1775. So both manifold pressure and power went up by about 20%. Some of the gains in power come from evaporation of the water methanol mixture in the intake tubing. I've seen statements that it was as much as 100 horsepower worth of evaporation, but there is zero data to back that up. I think it was actually about 50 horsepower. The majority of the power increase comes from the extra manifold pressure, not from the vaporization effect in the intake tubing. Now, the 109s typically ran on B4 fuel, which had an octane rating of 87. Late in the war, they had C3 fuel in limited amounts, which had a rating of 100 octane. The MW50 system was normally used with the more commonly available B4 fuel. The MW50 system in the 109G could be used for 10 minutes at a time, followed by a 3-minute cooldown period. The most reliable source I could find says that it could be used 3 times for a total of 30 minutes of usage. Now that's in the G models. That's a lot, and after 30 minutes at 1775 horsepower, or whatever the plane is putting out at altitude, the airplane's going to be a bingo fuel anyway. Now, since we know the size of the tank, and we know that it could spray for 30 minutes, we know the flow rate, which was about 45 gallons or 170 liters per hour. I could not find specific fuel flow data for this engine at that power setting, but it had to be up around 150 gallons per hour. So that gives us a CFR of 0.3 to 1. Using NACA's data, we can figure out the effective octane of B4 fuel with the MW50 system operating and spraying at that rate. Or at least we can get darn close. Using straight water, which they did in some emergencies, that would give fuel with an octane rating of 87 an effective octane rating of about 96. With a mixture of 50% methanol, it would have been a little bit over 100. At this point, it should be clear why the G model didn't normally use the 100 octane C3 fuel with the MW50 system. Since the system provided the B4 fuel with enough anti-knock protection, it would have been a waste of the precious C3 fuel to combine the two at 1.7 ATA. Back to the MW50 system itself, I think the reason they went with a single nozzle location instead of the more advanced spray bar system was entirely logistical. They had to retrofit the MW50 system onto planes in the field. Taking apart intake manifolds, drilling and tapping everything would have taken time, not to mention all the extra parts that would have to be manufactured, tested, transported, and installed. Since they were only going to inject at one point and only at a 0.3 to 1 CFR, this system was perfectly adequate and did the job well. I should also point out that at times they ran a 30% mixture of methanol, which would not be quite as effective but still darn good. As I mentioned earlier, there are even some cases where they use straight water due to supply issues. Occasionally, and I've seen evidence of this, they used ethanol in water. Now, straight water would reduce the power compared with the methanol mixture because it's essentially impossible to get any extra power from the evaporation effect with only water. NACA has proven that. Of course, with straight water, you still get big power gains because of the manifold pressure increase. Also, if the water freezes, the MW50 system won't work. So without methanol, the system becomes useless in the winter or at altitude. Now, with ethyl alcohol in water, that will of course solve the freezing issue, but it's only slightly more effective than straight water as an anti-knock agent. I think that's enough on the various fluids. Now, the fastest G model is the G10 seen here. It has a top speed of 426 miles per hour at just over 24,000 feet. That's still a bit below the P51D. No combat variant of a 109G was realistically faster than a P51D. Now, I've looked at this very carefully, and if the P51 is at 75 inches of manifold pressure, it is faster than every combat G variant at every altitude. So, all this brings us to the ultimate 109, which was the 109K4. The 109K4 is the only 109 combat variant that is faster than the P51D, or at least arguably so. And of course, we're talking about real 109s that actually flew in the war. Now, it's only slightly faster, and then only in a specific range of altitudes. Even then, depending on the source you use, and the way the P51D is configured, and exactly which variant of the K4 we're talking about, this is very close and could go either way. That said, the fastest K4 has a maximum speed of 452 miles per hour at just under 20,000 feet. The lower numbers for the K4 put them around 440 to 444 at around 24,500. The P51's maximum speed varies a little bit with engine variant and other factors, but generally at top speeds from 437 to 445. Now, this is in the range, and I'm going to hugely simplify this, but generally speaking, in the range from 15,000 feet to 25,000 feet, the 109K is slightly faster than the P51D. So how did the Germans pull this off with an old design? Well, they used some minor aerodynamic improvements. They fitted new wing fairings, a retractable tail wheel with tail wheel doors, and some main wheel well doors, which were sometimes removed at the front lines, causing yet another variable we can't really account for. Up front, there were at least 3 variants of the DB605 engine. The top dog was the DB605DC, which was run with both C3 fuel and MW50. With this combination, at times it was authorized to run at 1.98 bar or 59.2 inches of manifold pressure, giving it 2,000 horsepower. This is likely the configuration that boosted it over 450 miles per hour. Another combination was the DB605DB engine. This was probably more common. It could be configured to run with either C3 fuel or with B4 fuel and MW50. Both combinations ran at 1.8 bar, 54 inches. With the C3 fuel, it put out 1,800 horsepower at sea level and 1,550 at just under 20,000 feet. Now with the B4 fuel, so the lower octane fuel, but with MW50, it had an additional 50 horsepower, which I think also shows the effectiveness of water methanol injection, or what the Germans called methanol water injection. Of course, with the extra power, it needed to spray more MW50 fluid, so now it ran the tank dry in 2 10-minute bursts of power, but that's still quite a bit of time for running that setting. Now all of these engines and allowable manifold pressure values varied constantly. As far as I can tell, the use of 1.98 bar was authorized. Then it was unauthorized due to complications with the extra power. Then it was authorized again. C3 fuel was often unavailable, sometimes bases they didn't have methanol. In short, we really have to cherry pick a specific and rare 109, the K model, and then in a specific configuration to argue that it was faster than the P51D, but that is a configuration that did exist. Nobody knows how many 109Ks were built, but it appears to be around 500, of which probably at least half were destroyed before they ever flew. The remainder would have been outnumbered by probably 10 to 1 or more once they were in the air. The plane's speed and incredible climb rate would have helped, but the situation was really hopeless for the German pilots by the time the 109K came around. Still, and I'm going to somewhat paraphrase author Martin Caden on this, a P-51 pilot in a 1v1 against a 109 at the end of the war did have to be seriously concerned. There was a chance, however small, that the 109 he was facing was a K4, and it could have been a K4 capable of 1.98 ATA, and it could have a pilot at the controls who has over 100 kills to his name. The 109 may have been outdated, but it did perform, and it was a fearsome opponent right up until the end of the war. Before we close this out, I want to add one more thing. I see a lot of talk about what the Germans should have done. Everybody's using 20/20 hindsight. People often argue that the Germans could have held out longer had they brought in the jet fighter sooner, shifted production from the 109 to the 190 or some other plane. Almost all of these arguments have fatal flaws in them. However, I do think that there is something they could have done, and I've never once heard anybody mention this. They could have brought the MW50 system into action in 1940. They knew about this technology. It required nothing new. It's simple, inexpensive, and easy to install. Imagine the effect of BF109Fs in 1940 with the MW50 type system, only using individual nozzles for each cylinder, so it could run a CFR of 0.6 to 1 instead of only 0.3. That would have allowed for an easy extra 200 to 300 horsepower with B4 fuel. Had the 109F been so equipped in 1940 and the FW190 set up that way in 1941, the various Allied air forces would have been in for a much rougher time. That's all I have for now. I hope you're having a great day, and goodbye.